Greetings to all the learners. Welcome to CEC lecture. The topic of analysis is governance and development. In this lecture, we shall attempt to explain various perspectives, various definitions with reference to the concepts of governance and development. We shall elaborate on several pros and the cons, the advantages, the disadvantages with respect to various theories of development. Further, we shall also explain on important debates involved with respect to various ideas, concepts in various theories of development. To begin with, how do we define governance? Now, governance, like any term in the public discourse, has various perspectives and definitions. A very popular definition of governance, that is given by United Nations Development Program, that is, governance comprises of exercise of economic, political and administrative authority to manage a country's affairs at all levels. The definition further says, and we quote, it comprises mechanisms, processes and institutions through which citizens and groups articulate their interests, exercise their legal rights, meet their obligations and mediate their differences. Now, this definition by UNDP, it gives us an idea about the various dynamics that are involved in the concept of governance. That is, it comprises mechanisms, processes, institutions with respect to citizens, state and further societal aspects. A very important concept with reference to governance is that of development. Quite often, governance is seen as the medium, is seen as the mechanism to generate the output of development. Mahagunje has identified 4 ways in which development can be used. So, 4 parameters by which we can understand the concept of development. Development can be seen as economic growth. Development can be understood as modernization. Development, thirdly, as per Mahagunje, can be understood as distributional justice, and that development can be identified as socio-economic transformation. Another important perspective with reference to development comes from the work of Todaro, and the work says, we quote from that, development is a multi-dimensional process involving the reorganization and reorientation of the entire economic and social systems. Now, as we try to understand development, let's now go towards various theories of development, and as we understand these various perspectives and related theories of development, we shall also delve on important debates that are there with respect to governance and development that often are there in the public domain owing to the various concepts, assumptions from various theories of development. The first theory of development, the perspective that we look into is the classical model of development. Now, the classical model of development draws strength from the laissez-faire economy. Now, laissez-faire, the French term, the laissez-faire perspective attempts to work on the assumption that is of minimal government intervention in the economy. The classical model of development based on laissez-faire economy restricts government intervention with respect to economic affairs. Now, as we try to understand the classical model of development and the laissez-faire perspective, an important work that we must always take into account is that by the 18th century Scottish economist, philosopher and author Adam Smith. Adam Smith argued against mercantilism, and he was a major proponent of laissez-faire economic policies. His very important book, The theory of moral sentiments. Now, in this book, Adam Smith proposed the idea of an invisible hand. And what is this invisible hand? It is the tendency of free markets to regulate themselves using competition, demand, supply, and self-interest. Another important book by Adam Smith, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, 1776. Now, in this book, there are arguments that how individuals need to fulfill self-interest, and this results in societal benefit. Adam Smith points it out that it is often known as, and we all see in terms of our academic research, that it is known as the invisible hand. And combined with the division of labor in the economy, this results in a web of mutual interdependencies. Now, what is the outcome then? That is, it promotes stability and prosperity through the market mechanism. Now, we must point out that even with respect to the idea of minimal government restrictions, Adam Smith definitely points out that for protecting national borders, for enforcing civil law, for engaging in public works, the role of government is important. But however, there is a outright mention that government interference with respect to market activities must be limited. Another perspective with respect to the issues concerning theories of development comes from the work of Karl Marx, and therein we will take reference to the ideas concerning historical materialism. Now, Karl Marx's theory of historical materialism, it can be said these are ideas presented by Karl Marx with reference to economy and society also. Now, material conditions or the economic factors affect the structure and development of society. Let us understand why it is called as historical materialism. Why historical? Because this work by Karl Marx traced the evolution of human societies from one stage to another. Further, why materialism? Because as per this perspective, matter or material reality, which is the basis for any change. Now, this work explains that how from primitive communism to slavery to feudalism to capitalism, then socialism followed by communism. What we see here is that all societies pass through unilinear evolution. Every society progresses stage by stage. The economics is the superstructure, that is, it is the basis of everything. Now, the economic superstructure is the basis of everything, and based on this base, the other aspects, namely the polity, the society, the governance also is defined. Class struggle then, it is fundamental to understand in every stage. Human society and therefore governance and development therein also is then, as per the perspective of historical materialism by Karl Marx, it is formed by the forces and relations of production. Now, as we just saw that how the perspective of historical materialism, the Marxist perspective, gives insight into a structural realm, namely with reference to the base and superstructure model. Development has also been, contextualized with reference to issues of global governance. And in this framework, we now discuss the modernization theory. Modernization theory emerged in 1950s. It attempted to explain how the industrial societies of North America, Western Europe developed. Now, the time of 1950s is very essential with reference to the global governance dynamics, because this was the time when Second World War had ended and the world was bifurcated into two different blocks, power blocks, based on competing ideologies of capitalism versus communism. In this scenario, the modernization theory seen with the context of rise of newly independent Afro-Asian countries attempted to explain why the industrial societies of North America and Western Europe developed. And it pointed out that societies develop in fairly predictable stages through which they become increasingly complex. Development depends primarily on the import of technology as well as other political and social changes, namely by industrialization, urbanization, bureaucracy, mass consumption, adoption of democracy. So the modernization theory, therefore, using these parameters of industrialization, urbanization, technology, democracy, mass consumption, attempted to present to us an explanation that why industrial societies of North America, Western Europe developed. Now, as we are talking about modernization theory, another interesting perspective comes from W. Rostow and the stages of economic growth. W. Rostow was one of the key thinkers in the 20th century development studies, an American economist and a government official. Prior to him, when we try to understand the literature with reference to comparative development approaches, we see that development has been based on the assumption that modernization was characterized by the Western world and that other countries should model themselves after the West. Rostow's Stages of Economic Growth 1960 presented 5 steps through which all countries must pass to become developed. Let us understand the 5 steps presented in Rostow's Stages of Economic Growth. First, traditional society. Second, precondition to take off. Third, take off. Fourth, drive to maturity. And fifth, age of high mass consumption. This model asserted that all countries exist somewhere on this linear spectrum and then they climb upward through each stage in the development process. The traditional society, this stage is characterized by a subsistent, agriculture-based economy with intensive labor and low levels of trading, and a population that does not have a scientific perspective on world, on technology thereof. With reference to preconditions to take off, here a society begins to develop manufacturing and a more national, international, as opposed to having a regional outlook. In the takeoff, Rostow describes this stage as a short period of intensive growth in which industrialization begins to occur and workers and institutions become concentrated around a new industry. Drive to maturity. In this stage, what one finds here is that it takes place over a long period of time as standards of living rise, use of technology increases, the national economy grows and diversifies. Age of high mass consumption, country's economy flourishes in a capitalist system characterized by mass production and consumerism. Now, as we just understood Rostow's 5 stages of economic growth, what is the importance of Rostow's perspective with reference to development and modernization theory? That is, we have to accept it that it is one of the most widely cited and discussed development theory. And then it presents to us important examples of the intersection of geography, economics and politics. Further, we also need to understand the critique of Rostow's modernization theory. Firstly, the goal, that is industrialization nations, that is it has a set goal with reference to industrialized nations. Then it ignores geography and history, that is the impact of colonization on economic development. It wrongly assumes, as we just saw through reading through all the 5 stages, that all countries have an equal chance to develop without looking into the population size, natural resources, location, amongst others. Now, as we just discussed the modernization theory, Roster's perspective, an alternate perspective with reference to development comes from dependency theory. The work of A.G. Frank, Development of Underdevelopment, is important to be discussed here. That is how source of cheap labor and raw materials for the developed countries, it is through this process poor countries were then further impoverished. When we look at the scale of analysis, we see that how the regional dynamics are used to explain the global development syndrome. Through historic, colonial and contemporary neo-colonial interaction, the concerns of the developing world are put forward, namely with the focus on unequal exchange and declining terms of trade. Now, with reference to dependency theory also, no doubt this theory gives us an alternate perspective looking into the structural dynamics of trade, the issues concerning unequal exchange. But however, there are critiques that have pointed out that when we look at revolution of the capitalist system, when we look at the bigger picture of revolution, somewhere it is not a viable option. Then there is too much importance on the role of government to serve the people, because with time there has been a debate, namely the amount of the space dynamics with reference to state and market. Now, as we are discussing the dependency theory, another important perspective with reference to development comes from the neo-Marxist imperialist theory. Paul Sweezy's work and Paul Brandt's work, they are important non-orthodox Marxist theories, especially Paul Brandt's work, that is Political Economy of Growth, is very important to be pointed out here. That it points out that how imperialism had penetrated underdeveloped countries and it had destroyed earlier social formations, distorted subsequent development and creating lasting conditions of dependency. Now, as we are discussing various perspectives and theories of development, a very important perspective comes from Fay Rannes' model of economic growth. Now, in this model, it is often called as dualism model in development economics or welfare economics, and it has been developed by John C.H. Fay and Gustav Rannes. It is often understood as an extension of the Lewis model, also defined and known as the surplus labor model. This model of economic growth and its approach towards development recognizes the presence of a dual economy comprising both the modern and the primitive sector. This approach takes the economic situation of unemployment and underemployment of resources into account, unlike many other growth models that consider underdeveloped countries to be homogeneous in nature. The primitive sector consists of existing agricultural sector in the economy, and the modern sector, it is the rapidly emerging but small industrial sector. The Fay Rannes model of economic growth, as per this model, development can be brought about only by a complete shift in the local point of progress from the agricultural to industrial economy, such that there is augmentation of the industrial output. This is done by transfer of labor from the agricultural sector to the industrial one, showing that underdeveloped countries do not suffer from constraints of labor supply. At the same time, growth in the agriculture sector must not be negligible, and its output should be sufficient to support the entire economy with food and raw materials. Another important perspective with reference to development comes from the O-ring model of economic development. Now, this refers to the theory that even smallest component of a complex production process must be performed properly if the end product of the process is to have any useful value. Now, when we think deeper into it, this also implies that mistakes that come even into the smallest of tasks can cause the final product to possess absolute no value to the users. This theory derives its name from 1986 incident in which the Challenger space shuttle was completely destroyed as a result of the failure of a simple gasket or a O-ring to work properly. It was proposed by American development economist Michael Kremer in 1993. Further, as we are discussing various approaches towards development, the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen developed the capability approach, which defined development as a tool enabling people to reach the highest level of their ability through granting freedom of action, freedom of economic and social and family actions amongst others. This approach became the basis for measurement of development by the Human Development Index, which was developed by UN Development Program in 1990. Martha Nussbaum developed the abilities approach in the field of gender and emphasized empowerment of women as a development tool. Jeffrey Sachs and Paul Collier focused on mechanisms that prevent or oppress development in various countries and cause them to linger in abject poverty for several years, namely poverty traps, civil wars, issues of natural resources. Identification of these traps enable relating to political, economic, social conditions, somewhere it is necessary as per this approach in an attempt to advance development. Further, an important perspective on development comes from the report Our Common Future, also known as the Brundtland Report, that points out that sustainable development is a development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So, what finds here is that governance as a process is very complex. It involves several perspectives, mechanisms, processes and institutions. And to add to that, there are various ways in which development can be conceptualized. It could be conceptualized with reference to minimal government intervention. It can be conceptualized with reference to looking at the structural aspects. It can be conceptualized with reference to looking at the capability perspective, issues of sustainability, women empowerment, amongst others. So, what one has to understand that one has to conceptualize governance and development in a broader framework, because today various dimensions of polity, economy, society have a bearing on which mechanisms, which approach, governance and the development model therein is used, it is adopted to cater to needs of the citizens. We hope that the lecture presented to you significant inputs and insights with reference to understanding various dimensions concerning governance and looking into various issues with reference to various concepts presented by various theories of development. We look forward to positive, encouraging feedback from you all. Thank you very much.